Darkness and Justice, a story of abuse of power, conspiracy, and inevitable justice. Chapter 1, Arrival in Jacksonville. The silver Ford Explorer sliced through the humid Florida air as the morning sun bathed the landscape in gold. Naomi Caldwell, 32, kept one hand on the wheel while adjusting the rearview mirror with the other. Jacksonville loomed ahead, a city with a troubled history and an even darker present. She wasn't here as a tourist. She was here to clean house. As a federal investigator with the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, Naomi had been assigned to audit and reform the Jacksonville Police Department, JPD, an institution plagued with allegations of police brutality, racial profiling, and internal corruption. Her case files were damning. Excessive force disproportionately used on minorities, suspiciously high number of missing persons after police encounters, falsified reports covering for rogue officers. Jacksonville wasn't just another assignment, it was a war zone, and Naomi had no idea that before she could even enter her office, she would become their next target. Chapter 2, The Traffic Stop. As Naomi merged onto Arlington Expressway, her instincts flared. Flashing blue and red lights filled her rearview mirror. Really? She muttered, checking her speed. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. Pulling over to the side of the road, she placed both hands on the steering wheel, a reflexive habit for every black person who had ever been pulled over by police. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. Roy Garrison, late 40s, tall, built like a linebacker, the kind of man who thrived on intimidation. Ethan Wilkes, younger, lean, but with the eager expression of someone desperate to prove himself. Roy approached first, knocking hard on the window. Bang, bang, bang. Step out of the vehicle, now. Naomi raised an eyebrow. No introduction. No reason for the stop. She rolled down her window just enough to speak. Is there a reason for this stop, officer? Ethan tilted his head, scanning the car. Your vehicle matches the description of a suspect. Naomi fought the urge to roll her eyes. I can provide my ID and my DOJ credentials. Before she could finish, Roy yanked open the door and grabbed her arm. I said out. Naomi clenched her jaw, suppressing her anger. She knew the drill. Resisting would only escalate things. She stepped out slowly. Then, a violent shove. Roy slammed her face first against the hood of her own car. Tough girl, huh? Let's see how tough you really are. A brutal elbow to the ribs sent pain radiating through her side. Naomi gasped, but refused to cry out. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Moments later, she was cuffed and thrown into the back of their patrol car, without ever being read her rights. Chapter 3, A Night in Jail, Jacksonville Police Department, Holding Cells. The air inside the holding cell was thick with the stench of sweat and bleach. Naomi sat on a cold metal bench, her wrist aching from the too tight handcuffs. No phone call, no formal charges, no explanation. She had simply been thrown in a cell and ignored. Outside, Roy and Ethan laughed with another officer. Guess we won't be hearing from her for a while? Roy sneered. Naomi's stomach churned. If they could do this to a DOJ investigator, what had they done to ordinary civilians? She needed to get out. Hours passed. Then, a voice outside the cell. A different officer, a young black man with sharp features and wary eyes, Danny Brooks, paused outside her door. Who are you? He asked. You don't belong here. Naomi lifted her chin. I'm Inspector Naomi Caldwell, U.S. Department of Justice. And you're about to have the worst day of your life. Danny's face went pale. Shit. Chapter 4. The storm breaks. Danny Brooks stood frozen, gripping the bars of Naomi's holding cell as her words sank in. A DOJ inspector? Here? Arrested by JPD? His pulse quickened. This was bad. Really bad. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted down the hall, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. He needed to find his commanding officer before this exploded into something uncontrollable. Naomi exhaled slowly, flexing her fingers. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs had dug in, but she ignored the pain. She had bigger concerns. Would Danny do the right thing? Or was he just another cog in the corrupt machine? Minutes passed. Then a door slammed open. A new voice, authoritative and furious, filled the hallway. What the hell is going on here? 15 minutes later, the station was in chaos. Jacksonville Police Chief Brian Wallace stormed into the holding area, face red with rage. Deputy Chief David Coleman trailed behind him, eyes dark with disbelief. When Brian Wallace saw Naomi sitting inside the holding cell, his face drained of color. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He spun toward Danny. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Danny hesitated. "Sir, she's DOJ, Inspector Naomi Caldwell." Brian Wallace's eyes snapped back to Naomi. She stood, brushing the dust off her blazer. "That's right. And I'd love to hear why I was thrown into a holding cell without charges." Silence. Then Wallace exploded. "Who authorized this arrest?" Roy and Ethan stood at attention nearby, their faces unreadable. Roy spoke first, his tone unapologetic. "She resisted arrest." Naomi's laugh was cold. "That's a lie, and you know it." She turned to Wallace, eyes burning. "Your officers assaulted me, threw me in a cell with no explanation. I complied, and they still used excessive force." Wallace ran a hand down his face. This was a career-ending disaster. He whirled on Roy and Ethan. "You two, office, now." The two officers exchanged glances before following him. Before disappearing into the hallway, Roy shot Naomi a dark glare. It sent a clear message. "This isn't over." Naomi lifted her chin. No, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 5. The investigation begins 24 hours later. DOJ headquarters, Jacksonville. Naomi sat at a long conference table, her bruised ribs aching beneath her blouse. Across from her, a team of DOJ officials had gathered, reviewing the situation. Anthony Reyes, her immediate superior, a no-nonsense man with salt and pepper hair. Linda Park, a civil rights attorney who specialized in law enforcement oversight. Elliot Crane, a DOJ investigator who had seen one too many dirty cops walk free. Reyes exhaled. "This is a goddamn mess." Naomi leaned forward. "It's more than that. Roy and Ethan weren't just two bad cops. This was routine for them. The Jacksonville PD has been covering up police brutality for years. My arrest proves it." Linda Park nodded, flipping through a folder. "You were lucky. If you weren't DOJ, you could have disappeared." Naomi's stomach turned. She had read the missing persons reports. Civilians who had gone up against JPD, most of them black or Hispanic, most of them never seen again. Elliot Crane's voice was grim. "If we're going to take this department down, we need proof. We need whistleblowers, documents, camera footage." Naomi's lips curled into a determined smirk. "Then let's get to work." Chapter 6. Digging Deeper. Naomi didn't waste any time. The next morning, she was back at the Jacksonville Police Department, not as an inmate, but as a federal investigator with full authority. She walked through the precinct's front doors, her bruised ribs screaming in protest, but she didn't let it show. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, some filled with curiosity, others with outright hostility. She wasn't welcome here. She didn't care. Inside the chief's office, Chief Wallace sat behind his desk, looking 10 years older than he had the night before. "You're back already," he muttered. "I never left." Naomi dropped a formal DOJ notice on his desk. "Effective immediately, the Jacksonville PD is under federal investigation. That means you, your officers, and your records are subject to review. Any interference will result in federal obstruction charges." Wallace's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "What do you need?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "Body cam footage from the last 6 months. All internal affairs reports related to excessive force. Personnel records of every officer with a brutality complaint." Wallace hesitated. "That's a lot." Naomi's gaze was ice cold. "Then you better start now." Chapter 7, Whistleblowers and Threats. Not everyone in the department was corrupt. 2 hours later, Naomi sat across from Danny Brooks, the young black officer who had realized who she was in the holding cell. "Roy and Ethan aren't the worst of them," he said, voice low. "There's worse?" Naomi asked. "A lot worse." Danny looked around nervously, making sure no one was listening. "Chief Wallace isn't the one running the real show. It's Deputy Chief Paul Henderson." "What's his game?" "Brutality, intimidation. And when that doesn't work, people disappear." Naomi's blood ran cold. "Disappear how?" "We don't ask." "But they never come back." Before Naomi could press further, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. A brick had just been thrown through the precinct's front window. Attached to it was a note: "Get out of Jacksonville, or else." Chapter 8, A City Built on Fear. Naomi picked up the brick with the note still attached. The edges were rough, the weight solid in her hands. This wasn't just a warning, it was a message. She turned to Danny Brooks, whose face had paled. "Is this common?" she asked. "For people who don't stay quiet?" Danny exhaled. "Yeah." 15 minutes later, Chief Wallace's office. Naomi dropped the brick onto Wallace's desk. "This is what happens when someone tries to expose the truth in Jacksonville?" she demanded. Wallace sighed, rubbing his temples. "This city, this department was built on fear. And you're just letting it continue?" Naomi shot back. Wallace hesitated. "I'm not a saint, Caldwell. But I also know how things work here. People who push too hard end up in body bags." Naomi leaned in, voice steady. "Then let's make sure we push hard enough to break this whole system." Wallace didn't respond, but he didn't stop her either. And that was enough. Chapter 9, The First Break. The body cam footage arrived at Naomi's DOJ office later that night. She and Elliot Crane, her fellow investigator, loaded the files onto their laptops. Hours of footage, countless arrests. Then they found it. Body cam footage, 2 weeks ago. The screen showed Roy Garrison and Ethan Wilkes pulling over a young black man. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. Roy: "Step out of the car." Civilian: "I haven't done anything wrong." A sudden, violent strike. The young man was dragged from his car, beaten, and thrown into a squad car. The worst part? The footage cut off before he was booked. Naomi rewound. Checked police records, no arrest report, no charges. The man was never processed, no sign of him anywhere. Elliot's voice was tight. "He's gone, isn't he?" Naomi's stomach twisted. He's not the only one. She pulled up multiple missing persons reports. All young black men. All last seen in JPD custody. This wasn't just police brutality. This was something much, much worse. Chapter 10. Disappeared without a trace. Naomi's hands tightened around the edges of the file. DOJ Field Office, 2:13 a.m. The screen in front of her showed the faces of 6 missing men, all young, black, and last seen in JPD custody. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't random. They didn't just vanish, Naomi murmured. They were erased, Elliot said grimly. Linda Park, the DOJ civil rights attorney, rubbed her temples. We need proof they were taken. We need to find their bodies. Naomi nodded. Then we start at the source. They needed someone inside the JPD to talk. Chapter 11. A whistleblower in danger. Jacksonville PD. Officer Danny Brooks' apartment. Naomi knocked 3 times, looking over her shoulder. The city was quiet, but her instincts screamed that she was being watched. Danny opened the door, tension in his eyes. You shouldn't be here, he muttered, stepping aside. Naomi entered quickly. I need answers, Danny sighed. I told you, people disappear. Naomi placed a file on his coffee table, the 6 missing men. Tell me how. Where do they go? Danny hesitated. Then he spoke. There's an old industrial site on the west side of town. It used to be a warehouse. Henderson and his men, he swallowed. They take people there. If someone talks too much, they don't come back. Naomi's stomach turned. They had just found the graveyard, and she was going to expose it. Chapter 12. The Warehouse of Secrets. Abandoned Warehouse. 3:27 a.m. Naomi crouched behind a row of rusted shipping containers, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The warehouse loomed ahead, a decayed skeleton of Jacksonville's industrial past. Beside her, Elliot Crane checked his sidearm. Are you sure about this? He whispered. Naomi didn't answer. She had to be sure. Danny Brooks' information had been too specific. If Henderson and his men had been disposing of evidence here, this was the key to blowing the entire operation open. They had to find proof. Naomi signaled, and the 2 of them crept forward. The warehouse doors were slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light illuminated the dusty interior. Someone was inside. She pressed herself against the metal frame of the door, listening. Voices, low murmurs. Someone was talking inside. She turned to Elliot and motioned for him to stay low. They slipped through the entrance, keeping to the shadows. Then they saw it. A pit. A deep, freshly dug pit in the center of the warehouse. Inside, the skeletal remains of multiple bodies lay half buried in the dirt. Naomi's stomach lurched. They had found the missing men. There was no mistaking it. This was a graveyard. Elliot exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ! Naomi pulled out her phone and began taking photos. They needed evidence. As she zoomed in on the remains, something caught her eye. A badge, a police badge, half buried in the dirt. Her blood ran cold. One of their own had been silenced. Suddenly, tires screeched outside. More backup was coming. We need to go now, Elliot urged. Naomi's mind raced. They couldn't just run. They needed to make sure this evidence got out. She turned to Elliot. Get to the car. Upload these to DOJ's secure server. If we don't make it out, they'll still have the files. Elliot hesitated. I'm not leaving you here. Naomi clenched her jaw. We can't both get caught. Go, now. Elliot hesitated for only a second before nodding. He bolted for the back exit. Naomi turned, gripping her gun. She'd buy him time. The warehouse doors slammed open. Deputy Chief Paul Henderson stepped inside, flanked by 4 armed officers. Chapter 13. Fire in the Dark. Henderson's eyes locked onto Naomi immediately. He didn't look surprised to see her. He had been expecting this. "Well, well," Henderson drawled, his voice eerily calm. "I figured you'd come snooping." Naomi didn't lower her gun. "Your operation is over, Henderson." He smirked. "You think exposing a few bodies will stop this?" She held her ground. "I think exposing you will." Henderson took a step closer, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, tilting his head. "You're in my city, my rules." Then he raised his gun. "And in my city, people like you don't make it out alive." Bang! Naomi dove behind a stack of wooden crates as the gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Splinters exploded into the air as the bullet tore through the crate where she had stood just seconds before. She didn't hesitate. She fired back. Bang! Bang! Her shots forced Henderson and his men to take cover. She needed to keep moving. Staying still meant death. She bolted toward the side of the warehouse, using the shadows for cover. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely alone. Another bullet whizzed past her ear, barely missing her. Henderson's voice rang out. "You can't win this, Caldwell. Walk away and maybe I let you live." Naomi gritted her teeth. "Not a chance." Suddenly, sirens. Red and blue lights flooded the warehouse from the outside. Henderson's men froze. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. Naomi allowed herself a small smirk. Elliot had made it. He had called for backup. Now the real fight was about to begin. Henderson's expression darkened. He knew his time was up, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He turned and ran toward a side exit. Naomi cursed and took off after him. She wasn't letting him get away. She sprinted through the warehouse, dodging crates and rusted equipment. Henderson was fast, but Naomi was fueled by something stronger: justice. As he pushed open the exit door, she leaped forward, grabbing the back of his jacket and yanking him down. They crashed to the ground. Henderson struggled, throwing a wild punch, but Naomi dodged and slammed her elbow into his face. His head snapped back. Naomi pinned him, pressing her knee into his back. "It's over, Henderson," she panted. The doors burst open. Officers flooded in. For the first time in his life, Paul Henderson was the one being arrested. Lessons learned from the story. Naomi Caldwell's story is not just an intense action thriller. It's a powerful reminder of justice, courage, and perseverance in the face of corruption. Here are some key takeaways from this story. 1. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. Naomi was unlawfully arrested, assaulted, and threatened by a corrupt police system. But she never gave up. She understood that the truth takes time to surface, and justice will always prevail if someone is willing to fight for it. Lesson: no matter how deeply corruption is embedded in a system, with enough evidence and persistence, the guilty will be exposed. 2. Courage doesn't mean no fear. It means acting despite fear. Naomi knew she was up against dangerous forces. She knew that whistleblowers before her had disappeared. But instead of backing down, she took action. Lesson: true bravery isn't the absence of fear. it's moving forward despite it. 3 one-person can make a big difference. Naomi didn't have an army behind her. She only had herself, a few allies, and sheer determination. Yet, she managed to take down an entire corrupt network. Lesson: never think that one individual cannot change anything. One person standing up can inspire others and bring down an entire corrupt system. 4. Evil thrives, not because it's strong, but because good people stay silent. There were honest officers like Danny Brooks in the Jacksonville Police Department, but they remained silent out of fear. That silence allowed corruption to thrive for years. Lesson: if good people don't speak up, evil will continue to rule unchecked. 5. Justice is not just a concept. It's an action. No one handed Naomi justice. She had to fight for it. If she had surrendered, Henderson and people like him would have continued to rule Jacksonville through fear. Lesson: justice doesn't happen by itself. It must be fought for. Conclusion: Naomi Caldwell's story is a powerful reminder that the truth can be hidden, but it can never be buried forever. Those in power often believe they are untouchable. But all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, and the whole system can collapse. Will you stay silent, or will you stand up for what is right? On fire.